of unintended consequences. When we pass a rule making a change or advocate a policy, we can say what we hope to accomplish, but we don't get to stipulate what we will actually accomplish. In general, almost every change brings unintended and unforeseen consequences. So, yeah, some thoughts on this one?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's just externalities in general. Like I think I mentioned previously, if I open a factory and I generate smoke, that can blow down into the neighboring field. Someone could inhale that. Someone could get cancer. Again, that's not because I'm deliberately trying to kill people, but those things have consequences. Same things with all our policies and everything. Okay, you blow up a village, you create terrorists because you radicalize the relatives of those people. Those people in turn join ISIS and attack American bases. So you can say, okay, we weren't trying to create terrorists, but again, the effects of what you do, the impact of what you're doing, it's going to have those effects.
One of these ones, I think I'll tie this in with incentives and also opportunity costs. Might tie in three of the things that we've talked about here, where you have certain incentives in the United States of America, certain affirmative action incentives where they say, oh, you need to hire this many people, especially when you're focusing on schools. Let's keep to the schools here. They say you need to have a certain amount of applicants or a certain amount of people joining your school of X race or X group. So this school says, okay, if we have there's grants by the government to give millions of dollars if we actually achieve these certain numbers. So they look at actually getting as many of those people into their schools, and they might even, in some cases, lower the standards of those people. They might say, okay, this other group has 100 people who are in the top 15 percentile of their actual achievements, of their actual levels to actually enter our school, but we have to get majority or a certain number of this other group that's only around the bottom 15 percentile. So we'll take that bottom group and more of those groups and keep those people from the top out. Now you bring those people into the school. Unintended consequences in there could be both your school itself at the end won't be achieving as many things in the research developments or the post-grad, people actually graduate and go on. In some of those cases, some of those people from that lower point that come in, they were already maxed at their ability, and now they could have gone to other schools that could have benefited from people at that level and raised their levels of achievements in that level, and they could actually end up graduating. Since they're put in this harder environment, this harder school, they don't actually get to the point where they actually graduate. They get dissuaded from it, and they look at all these other people achieving at such higher levels, and they start comparing themselves to something else. And then you have those people kind of drop out and get disenfranchised with the whole idea of schooling and education and start thinking the system is against them. So that's an unintended consequence. That's the incentives right there. That's a lost opportunity cost from the other universities by you saying we're going to take all these people and put them in our school just because we need them. So those are things that tie in there that are very important to keep in mind.
Well, I was thinking too, even like that whole thing with Bill Gates and IBM, how originally he worked for IBM and he offered to do what he did there, and they said no. And then, of course, down the line, he went off, started Microsoft, and of course, they were kicking themselves. Oh, we could have had this great technology. IBM could have been a few times wealthier than it is now. But again, at the time, what do you know? Oh, here's some younger, geeky kid who dropped out of Harvard. How is this what's going to come out of this? It's easy to look back and say, oh, they should have done this. But at the time, who knew?
Yeah. And that's why, going back to what we talked about earlier, was there's not some big mafia or Illuminati out there that was like, oh, we need to kick Bill Gates out of we need to kick him out of out of IBM, so eventually he can start his own company. Then now he's going to invent his own Illuminati and start destroying it. It's like, no, people just have different incentives and they do different things, and those are the things that happen. Okay, moving on to number 5. People often break the rules when they can, or in fancier language, people engage in strategic non-compliance. I think with that one, anybody who has a job, or even if you have your own business, I think you can think of some times where you kind of skirted some kind of general agreement, general rule, and some can be deadly. But in general, I think we do this a lot.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
We'll get into it in the chapter about moral language, but there's a really interesting book. I haven't read it, but they cited about the elephant in the brain. It's called, where they talk about how we find ways to rationalize our behavior, where it's like we're not being outright evil, but we find ways to sort of bend the rules and justify it in our own head. And I think I mentioned it in the previous video, but there's that very good one from the real life Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street guy, where he talks about how he became corrupted. And it was the same thing. It's not, oh, I woke up one day and decided to swindle all these people. It's, I'll charge a little more for this. I'll lie a little bit about this. by the time when you look at where he started and where he ended, that's what happened. And I've seen this too with people who cheat on their spouses or partners. It's the same thing. Oh, I'm just meeting her for drinks. She just kissed me on the cheek. Like you keep finding ways to rationalize incrementally in your head, and it gets worse and worse. And eventually, it's like, oh wow, what have I done?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's human nature. I mean, I'm not above it either. So.
Yeah. I was listening to the Bill Whittle show, and he was talking about something with the campaigns or the debates, and he was saying when it comes down to it, it's often a question of if this is a question he asks a lot of people when they ask about leaders, when they ask about presidents. If I had a loved one whose life was depending on someone, one of these two candidates, and one of them had to lie on behalf of my loved one in order to save their life, who would I trust more? That was an interesting way of looking at things. And I think when you talk about politics is about lying. It's like professional liars, legal liars.
Yeah.
So when people are like, oh, shock, I can't believe this politician's acting this way. I'm like, what do you think politicians are about? Like, that's what politics is about. Like, if they're honest, I'm like, shock. I'm like, wow. That's the point where you're like, okay, if they actually follow all the rules, then that's not really politics. It's all about skirting the rules and making these things. And that's part of why these regulations and things like that also occur, where they find ways to kind of be like, okay, let's set up enough rules where we're able to comply with these rules, but these other people are not able to comply with them. And if you actually had to comply with every single rule and law that's out there, that whole thing that people say, well, we'd be in jail 100 times a day, would be for federal crimes and things like that. No matter what country you live in, it's a common thing.
Well, I laughed too because there was something I saw going around about like, oh, the good old days when families were together and politicians were honest. All this, I'm like, when were politicians ever honest? I mean, read about the real stories about Lincoln and Washington. It's like, some people say Washington married his wife because she was connected. He was able to get access to these plantations. He had Washington, D.C. set up where it was, so the value of his estate would increase. It's like, this has always been the case. This isn't like, there's sort of this idea that there's this romanticized era when, oh, these were true statesmen who put their self-interest. No, I mean, this is how it's always been. It's just, it's easier in retrospect to look at it with rose-colored glasses. And then, and I always, again, back to Obama, I always bring up like, recent times, especially with the internet, is running about promises with Obamacare. Look at what happened. And again, I realize it's not 100% his fault. You have to go up against the American Medical Association. He had to go up against the insurance company. So it's not something that's easily fixable, but he wanted to get elected. So of course he's going to tell everyone what they want to hear. And then the consequences it doesn't pan out as expected. Oh, well, not my problem. I'm out of office.
Yeah. And it goes back to that whole state of nature thing where people think there's this kind of Nirvana, Eden type of thing where we were just these perfect beings before we had this fall from grace. Like that's not the way history is. And it also shows the importance and power of people being able to censor. And I think why the United States of America is partially why the United States of America is so exceptional. It's enshrinement of the free speech thing, the right to actually go out and say things, have your ideas actually be heard, have information be spread, the freedom of the press. So when you have the press censoring things and choosing, that's what they've been doing for the majority of their existence. They've been choosing. This whole idea of fake news is not new. No. People make choices, even if it's not fake, even if they decide to say real things. What they decide to not talk about is something that you don't hear about in the past. The fact that we're hearing about some of these things is the new thing. The fact that we actually have the ability to know some of this information, I think, is kind of just, it's amazing. I think we should really appreciate how unusual and how positive that is a state of being to be in. Thank you for listening. This has been a clip from an actual longer recording that I'll try to leave a link to on the screen or somewhere around here where you're listening to this.
Presents. 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 Presents.
Peasants.
Okay.